welcome to our 2026 study of the book of Revelation, a study we are entitling Analyzing the Apocalypse of John, a study that will take us through the book of Revelation, beginning in its first chapter, going all the way to the end of the book, and doing our best to understand what this book of the Bible has to say. It has been a thoroughly requested study by several of you. It's been something that's been on my radar for quite some time. I had considered doing this in a Bible class setting at the congregation in the building one of these days, but then as I thought about it more, I realized that maybe this would be a good way for us to talk about the book and be able to express things that are a little bit easier here than they might be in other settings. This is a bit more bite-sized, for example. The episodes are going to be naturally shorter, so maybe that will help us to understand the book a little bit more thoroughly and to digest what it says. So that way we're not just going through a single chapter at a time. We'll go as quickly as we can, but also as a good pace would dictate. Now, as we enter into our study, this first episode is for us to level set what our expectations are about Revelation. And it's to help us to understand that the book of Revelation requires us to think a bit more critically than sometimes we might do ordinarily. And sometimes that's a natural process. Sometimes we just get caught up in thinking the same old things that we've always had. But with Revelation, we've got to understand that we can't approach it that way. But let's take a step back from that thought for just a moment. I want us to just broadly think about how, before we begin reading any book, whether it's in the Bible or not, we bring with us a lot of assumptions. Those assumptions are natural. It's part of how our intellect operates. There's nothing wrong with it on its own. But those assumptions can help us in some cases, and in other cases they can hurt us. And these assumptions are based on a variety of factors that we might have heard. We might know the information, we might have some level of familiarity with it, someone else might have told us about it, we might have certain beliefs that we want to have about what we're reading. So all of these things factor into what we're reading and what we take away from it and what we're going to enter into it with, and the perspective we're going to have just by beginning the reading to start off with. Let's think about two examples that help to illustrate this concept. The first example is your car manual. I want you to think about that manual for just a moment. You may not want to, but just humor me. So we're thinking about our car manual. We know right off the bat that's not an entertaining read. We know it's informative. If there's something specific we're trying to find, like how to replace the headlights or the service intervals or something like that, man, it's a great read. But it's not very entertaining, is it? But that's an assumption, isn't it? Because we don't necessarily know for sure, unless we've already read it, that it is boring or entertaining or whatever the case may be. Maybe it's somewhere in between. We just don't know. Maybe it has some great comic strips in it. Maybe it has some good humor that the engineers put in the book. We don't know that, but we assume because it's a car manual, it's a technical guide. It's not meant to be for casual reading. We automatically assume that it's going to be boring but informative. But again, those are assumptions unless we have actually read it ourselves. Think about another example that may be a bit more familiar to us. We have a book that's been recommended to us by a friend. And because they recommended it to us, we assume that it's going to be a good read. This person has raved about it. They told us how great this book is and how much it changed their lives, or just in general how much entertainment they got out of the book. And then we buy it and we read it and we think, this is horrible. And that assumption fizzles out. But we went into the reading with this understanding and with this assumption that it would be good because the person recommending it said it was. So you can understand the problem with those assumptions. We can see why this may not be the best approach. Now again, in general, it's not a bad thing. We're able to weed through that and work through it in general ways with other things, but you can see likely why this is a problem when it comes to the Bible. Because we have certain assumptions that are built into our minds that as we approach the Bible and we approach the books that are in the Bible, we might have the assumptions that are not quite correct concerning what it actually says. And that's what we've got to work on as we approach the book of Revelation. This is a book that has a lot of assumptions about it. And all of us are guilty of this at some point or another. We've heard things about it, we've read it ourselves, whatever the case may be, and we draw certain conclusions that may or may not actually be accurate. I'll give you a couple examples of this. The amount of people that I've heard who have actually said concerning Revelation, and not just average people, I'll say. I'm talking about scholars, I'm talking about people who you would think would not say this, actually are sometimes the ones who do, that the book can't be understood. That there's really no message to it. It's just kind of incoherent. It's the ramblings of a madman. It's not really something that we can quite understand. And that it was included in the Bible and maybe shouldn't have been. I've heard that from people before. And I've heard that from some surprising people, actually, that would genuinely floor you if you were to know concerning these scholars, especially, who might have said these things. So the book cannot be understood as an assumption. That's an idea we might enter into it with, and so we would say, based on that, don't even spend any time with it. Don't fool with it. Just leave it alone. You can't understand it. Don't even try. That's all an assumption. Another danger that we encounter regarding this, we assume that what someone knowledgeable has said about it must be true. So it could be me. It could be someone else that you trust, someone else that you are aware of who has said certain things about Revelation, and we think, well, this person knows that, this person has studied it, they know all about it. That must be true, when in fact it may not be true. And so we've got to be very mindful of these assumptions. And the goal that we have is to set these things aside, to have openness to the message of Revelation itself, and not enter into the book with this baggage that only weighs us down and keeps us from really understanding what is being communicated. We've got to have that openness to the book. We've got to have that openness to the change that we might have to have in our perspective to really grasp the ultimate message. Let's talk about some perspectives that are founded on assumptions. And these are perspectives we want to avoid on Revelation that do not reflect the truth of God's Word. Now, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I could have easily had 4 or 5 slides just on this one alone. But I thought as I was going through this that going into deep on all these different issues may not be the best use of our time, especially since our goal is to look at the text of Revelation, not to talk about theory. But I did want to touch on this because these are important points that we want to be mindful of as we enter into our study. And these are things that we are not really going to want to trend toward as we read through the book. So first of all, there's this belief that Revelation has no specific application. It's very closely related to what we just talked about, where there are some who say you cannot understand the book. These two tend to go together. But here you have this idea that there's nothing really concrete about the book. It's just kind of generic, and it's just this continuous battle between good and evil. And that's how they're going to see the book in this particular perspective. They're going to read Revelation. They're not going to see anything specific. There's nothing that has any application whatsoever to events, whether past, present, or future. It's all just the struggle between good and evil. And while we might see some merit to that when we start reading the book, it becomes very clear that the book is not ambiguous. It's not generic. There's something more specific it's trying to communicate. So this view right off the bat just doesn't satisfy what the book actually teaches. There's another view that goes along with this. The idea that Revelation addresses every event in church history until Christ's return. This is a very common belief. In fact, you'll find that many of the reformers from the Middle Ages would have believed in something like this. They would have said Revelation is this idea where these different chapters represent different points in the history of the church. So you have the rise of the Catholic Church being depicted in Revelation, and you have Martin Luther and what he did back in the 16th century being depicted in Revelation, and all these different events that are taking place, Revelation predicted them. And it was specific, and it was concrete, and all these different things. But again, that may not be quite where Revelation is communicating to us either. And so we're going to have to study through that and understand why that view doesn't really address what Revelation is actually saying. And then finally, as far as the perspectives that we want to avoid, there's this idea that Revelation's events are completely futuristic. And what I mean by that is you enter into the book of Revelation with the assumption, with the idea that the book is only talking about things that are future from your perspective. So as I'm reading it, it'd be future from my perspective, or as you're reading it, future from your perspective. So these things have not happened at all yet. There's nothing in the book that has been fulfilled. And there's some nuance to this. So as with all these perspectives, there's always nuance. I'm not trying to depict it as though this is the end-all be-all. But that's a very common view as well. In fact, most of those who are in denominations, when they talk about Revelation, this is likely going to be something that's part of what they believe concerning this book. They're going to see it as completely futuristic. Perhaps you've heard about the Battle of Armageddon. In fact, you know that word Armageddon. It's something that's used repeatedly when we talk about some type of large battle. And you'll hear that come up numerous times among a lot of conversations. That comes from the book of Revelation, and it specifically comes because that perspective leads people to think that has not actually happened yet, that it's talking about a physical battle. There's going to be a physical battlefield, all these different things. That is seeing Revelation as something that is completely futuristic, that really didn't have a whole lot to do with the Asian Christians in the first century, and really only pertained to things that were to come thousands of years after they were all gone. As you might imagine, just on the basis of the fact that it has no application to the people who read it the first time, you can see where there's some deficiencies in this perspective. We'll go over that as we go through the book to try to correct that a little bit and help us to understand why that's maybe not the best way to see this book. But again, I just wanted to mention on the front end so we know how not to approach the book as we enter into the text. So none of these perspectives, not any of these three, and really there's no others that fit the bill when it comes to how Revelation should be seen. None of these perspectives really capture the fullness of the book. So we want to make sure that we don't enter into Revelation with these things, and that we're careful to abandon them if we have them, or at very least to be willing to think differently about it if this is how we see things. So before we really get into the text, which we're not going to do in this discussion, I'll tell you right off the bat here, but we're going to be talking about it very soon. So that's going to be our next topic, is actually getting into the text and looking at some details. But before we do that, I want to be crystal clear about how we're going to approach the book of Revelation in this study. That way we're all on the same page right out of the gate and we know what to expect. So our approach, first and foremost, is to find the original meaning of the book. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Isn't that obvious? Isn't that what we always want to do, is to find the original meaning of the book in the Bible before we take it any further? You would be correct. But I want to be explicit in stating that because I want us to understand that our goal in studying Revelation is not to just see what it means for us. Obviously, that's going to be part of it. But first and foremost, we have to find what this would have meant to the people who received it to begin with, because then we can draw the right conclusions based upon what it means for us, and we can see how it actually applies to us in a more powerful way than if we did the opposite and we said, well, this is what it means to us first, and now let's try to find out what it meant to the people who originally received it. That's putting the cart before the horse. So we want to make sure we do things right. We want to find that original meaning. We want to find out why the Asian Christians needed this message, why they received this book to begin with, why John saw fit to write it, why God saw fit to inspire John by the Holy Spirit to bring this book to pass. Those are the details we want to ask and answer as we go through our study. Along with that, our approach is going to seek the Old Testament for answers on how to understand the symbols that this book uses. So the book of Revelation is inundated, absolutely inundated, full of imagery from the Old Testament. There are figures that we're going to talk about that indicate hundreds and hundreds of different references to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. Not direct quotations always. There are occasionally direct quotations, but more often than not, the idea of an illusion. Not an illusion in terms of something that deceives and isn't real, but allusion. Or that is, you're alluding to something that came before, and you're not quite spelling it out, but you're pointing to it in some respect. Revelation is chock full of that sort of thing. So we want to look at that and try to understand that and unwind that. I believe that factor on its own will help us to understand the book better than anything else will. Because if we can understand the language and symbolism in the Old Testament, we can see how it is applied in the book of Revelation and likely come to the right conclusion. Because we're going to see those things match up. And that's what really the approach that Revelation seems to take, is to use that symbolism from the Old Testament that the readers would have known about and been familiar with, and to kind of encode its message that way, so that way they would be able to unravel it and see what was being communicated. And above all, as we think about Revelation, we want to see this as a book of victory. We don't want to be tied down to any particular ism. We don't want to fall into any sort of pit of one perspective over another. We want to see it, though, above all, as a book of victory. We want to make sure we see it for what it is, that is depicting to us who are in Christ that through Jesus we have victory, that he has won the victory for us, that we have nothing to fear, whether it be from a government, whether it be from Satan, whether it be from some other hostile spiritual power. It doesn't matter. We have victory through Jesus, and he is the one who enables that to be possible, and that ultimately is what Revelation is going to be about. But I say that now, but we're going to prove it as we go through our study. I'm going to go ahead and conclude here. I believe we have a good understanding of how we don't want to approach the book of Revelation, but also we all understand how we want to approach it. So this will inform how we go about reading Revelation and understanding it. It's going to be critical as we go through all of this to how we're going to see the book and what lessons we draw from it. But for now, like I said, we'll conclude here. We'll pick up in our next conversation actually getting into the details of the book and our introduction to it. We'll talk a little bit about the writer, the date, the circumstance. You know the drill that we're going to get into there, and we'll continue on from that point. As always, I thank you for your time and attention to this. I hope this has helped you to understand what our intentions are as we begin this study, and we're going to have a good year in 2026, reading through the book of Revelation and striving to do our best to understand its message for the Asian Christians and also for us today. Thank you.